We just listened to the first 2 episodes of a new podcast, and we want to tell you all about it.
The show is called Nobody Should Believe Me, and it's a groundbreaking investigation into Munchausen by proxy. Anyone who listens to Murder Sheet knows we really appreciate a deep dive into a subject. Well, no one has ever done anything of this depth and breadth on the topic before. You will be enthralled by the stories it tells, but even more importantly, you will learn a great deal about how to keep kids in your community safe from harm.
But what makes this show different is that the host of the podcast, novelist Andrea Dunlop, has a uniquely personal connection to this subject. Someone close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy a while ago. So to her, this is not just something that happens to other people. Her personal story really gives this show an emotional punch.
It also means she really makes an effort to get at the humanity of all of the people involved, all the victims and survivors. This isn't a podcast that focuses on the gruesome details. It has heart. Andrea really uses her storytelling skills to help us get to know the wide variety of people whose lives have been affected by Munchausen by proxy.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Content warning. This episode contains descriptions of brutal violence and murder.
In the black and white photograph, the man and woman lie massacred on the bed. There's blood spatter all over the walls, blood on their bodies, blood on the white pillows. John's head tilts up toward the metal bed frame, leaving his pale neck exposed. Blood streaks his mouth and cheeks, and completely coats his face above his nose. The place where his eyes should be are just dark holes. Lucille's body is twisted into an L shape, with her bloody head angled toward the window. Her visible arm bears bruises and gouges, signs of a struggle with a depraved killer. I don't know if it's a trick of the light, but her face looks like it's been crushed. In life, John ran the Golden Pheasant Inn on the outskirts of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Lucille worked there as a waitress. They were a couple, not married, but thoroughly committed to one another. John had a reputation for patience and diplomacy, valuable traits for the proprietor of a roadhouse business that could sometimes attract rowdies. Lucille was a devoted mother who was gracious enough to stay friendly with her ex-husband. They were people. They were more than the slaughtered corpses their killer left on that bed. But all these years later, we don't know who committed this evil act of carnage. On May 19th, 1930, someone slipped into the Golden Pheasant Inn, murdered these two, and disappeared into the night. My name is Anya Kane.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murder Sheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Anya and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murder Sheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We don't just rely on skimming the headlines. We dive into these cases to bring you in-depth coverage.
We're the Murder Sheet, and this is the Golden Pheasant Murders. We call ourselves the Murder Sheet for a reason. We maintain a literal murder sheet of all the bar and restaurant homicides that we can find, going all the way back to the brutal tavern brawls of the 1600s. Whenever we can, Kevin and I spend time trawling Google and newspapers.com to find new additions to our list. Newspapers.com is how I first came across the Golden Pheasant murders. Pretty quickly, I realized that I wanted to know everything I could about this case. The name Golden Pheasant sounded shady but gaudy, a little roadhouse reaching for opulence. And the killings themselves were so brutal, so mysterious. The setting of 1930s Wisconsin added to the intrigue. The Midwest may have a wholesome reputation in some circles, but the 30s were a turbulent decade for the region, marred by ransom kidnappings, robbery gangs, and poverty. I knew we had to cover this case for the podcast.
We reached out to the Green Bay Police Department and got bounced around for a bit until we were finally connected with Sergeant Michael Knetzger. Here's Mike.
I'm a 28-year law enforcement veteran. I'm a patrol sergeant with the Green Bay Police Department, currently on the day shift, where they say most people go to retire.
But Mike doesn't just focus on modern-day mysteries. He's also a bit of a historical detective.
I bring a pretty unique background to the table. In addition to my work in law enforcement, I've been an educator for the past 20 years. I do have a doctoral degree in criminal justice management. And I've written and published 5 books, including, a book that contains a story we're going to talk about today. It's called True Crime in Titletown, USA, Cold Cases.
Side note, you can find that book on Amazon. But keep in mind that Mike is going to re-release it with an additional cold case story soon, so keep an eye out.
Talking to Mike, we learned that the Green Bay Police Department is an agency that cares about its history. The station maintains a small museum, complete with artifacts from old cases. It also devotes resources to some of the puzzling mysteries that endure within the city. In the early 2000s, Mike was investigating one such case, an infamous bank robbery, when he came across an unsolved double homicide.
And I kind of came across this one, the Golden Pheasant murders, by accident.
We don't want to get too off track here, but Mike basically proved that Hoosier Hellraiser and #1 suspect, John Dillinger, didn't commit a bank robbery where an officer was shot in the head. Pretty wild.
So when I was going through the records for that particular case, a historian at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, told me about the Golden Pheasant. And I had never heard about the Golden Pheasant murder case. And I'm a transplant from Milwaukee, so I didn't grow up in Green Bay. But I've always enjoyed researching. I've enjoyed writing. So what drew me to it primarily was that it was unsolved. It was a historic cold case, which kind of fell in line with what I was researching at the time. And it shook the community, back in 1930, which is when it occurred. And I had some success with the bank robbery case, and I figured, well, this will be the next one that I'm going to pick up.
So, quickly, Mike went about seeing what kind of records existed for the Golden Pheasant case. He made one especially gruesome discovery with the help of a museum curator.
I had been with the curator, like I said, at the university here in our city, and she recommended I go to the museum, and we have a museum in downtown Green Bay. Well, I met the curator there. I told her what I was looking into, and she said, Mike, we don't tell people this normally, but since you're a police officer, we kind of have a secret crime scene collection that nobody knows about. And that's how I found the picture of this original crime scene. Back in the 1930s, we didn't have crime scene photography. We hired a family portrait guy, a professional photographer, and we said, hey, if we ever have a crime scene, you want to take pictures? And he's like, yeah, thumbs up. So what essentially happened was he ended up dying in the 1960s, and the photographer and his family is going through his belongings, and they come across this box of, grisly death scene photos, and they have no idea what to do with them. So they essentially, instead of throwing them away, they go to the museum and say, hey, do you want these? Well, the museum kept it. There was some historical value that somebody perceived. So that's how I came across the crime scene photo.
The brutal pictures give a glimpse to a dark side of Green Bay's history that few are familiar with.
Anytime somebody hears Green Bay, what do they think of the Green Bay Packers, right? The NFL football team, it's what we're known for, which is a great thing. But there's also so much of history that is lost because it's so overshadowed by the Green Bay Packers. Like most people don't know, for example, that Zachary Taylor, who became a United States president, he commanded Fort Howard, which was on the west side of Green Bay at the time. And it was considered a primary port of entry during the early times of our country. So they built a fort at the entrance to Green Bay, and that's where Zachary Taylor was a commander before he became president.
As he did during his investigation into the bank robbery, Mike had to dive into the seedy underbelly of Green Bay in 1930.
If we're talking at the time, 1920s, 1930s, the city itself, Green Bay proper, was much smaller. We had the town of Preble on the east side, which is actually where this murder occurred. And then we had the town of Howard, which was on the west side of the city, which was also then, of course, named after Fort Howard. The gates of Fort Howard actually still stand today in an alleyway on the west side, which is pretty cool to see. The iron gates still stand. And Green Bay at the time, much like the rest of America, it was definitely a blue-collar community. It was suffering the same impact of prohibition that all parts of the country were at the time. But unfortunately, it had its seedier side as well, especially this area where the Golden Pheasant murders occurred. It was known for, of course, its bootlegged beer and liquor. It was known for its prostitution as well. But it was also a very hardworking community. And it still remains a hardworking community today and is known for its blue-collar Midwest attitudes.
Despite the underworld element that sprung out of Prohibition, Green Bay wasn't exactly known for being especially crime-ridden. Its core was a well-established downtown, with big, beautiful houses. Quiet farmland surrounded much of the city. That being said, the outskirts and suburban areas did draw in some businesses that catered to citizens' seedier needs. One of those joints was the Golden Pheasant.
We don't want you to get the wrong idea. The Golden Pheasant Inn was not an out-of-control den by any means. Owner John von Veghel was no hardened criminal. He was a businessman. But, times being what they were, it was in his business's interests to establish a place where Wisconsinites could go to look for a good time, a spot where they could find certain outlawed goods and services. After all, in 1930, the repeal of Prohibition was still 3 years away.
It had slot machines in it, and at the time the murders occurred, there was a burglary ring that was going around the city where they were stealing from slot machines. And that was also a place to go. But the slot machines, the bootlegged beer and liquor, and the prostitution, of course, that were occurring, well, all of that was a violation of law. And it was also known to be a place where, prostitutes would meet with their customers, let's say.
And if things got too hot, the Golden Pheasant could just take a bit of a hiatus.
And you would have, the owner was John Van Veghel. There were times where if he would get a tip that the feds were coming into town, well, we close things down. So, a lot of bar, restaurant type of owners and proprietors had to be conscientious of the enforcement by the federal government of prohibition and gambling and such that would occur.
The Golden Pheasant was also popular among locals for one particularly delicious dish.
It was very famous for its chicken, as a matter of fact.
Now, who exactly are John Van Veghel and Lucille Birdsall, the two victims we told you about in the introduction? We asked Mike to share what he's been able to gather about the couple at the heart of this case.
Well, John was the owner. John Van Veghel was 36 at the time, and he was the owner, and Lucille Birdsall was 24. John, to my knowledge and recollection, I don't believe was ever married. He was very involved in business. He wanted his business to be successful. He did suffer some loss earlier in life due to some of the pandemics and flus that were going around at the time. But he was known to be a very generous person. Wanted to avoid drama at all costs. If he had some sort of dispute with people, he'd kind of, brush it off and say, we'll be able to settle it tomorrow when the other hothead cools down. So he was definitely more of a diplomatic person.
Lucille was a waitress at the Golden Pheasant and John's girlfriend. Previously, she had been married for about 8 years to a man named Frank Kupsik. She and Kupsik had even had a daughter together, who lived up north in Sturgeon Bay, near Birdsall's parents.
Lucille had been married very early in life. She was married at 16. One of the primary reasons for their divorce, based upon the records, is he wanted to go to Milwaukee. Because if he went to Milwaukee, he could make like 75 cents more per hour doing what he was doing. And she wanted to stay close to her parents. So that became a primary source of strain. So they got divorced. He went to Milwaukee. Kid goes north to Sturgeon Bay, and Lucille is working at the Golden Pheasant, where she's working as a waitress, and she would also occasionally be a cook. After they split up, they remained good friends. They remained good friends. They co-parented well together, as much as you can back then, right? Where distance and communication were much different than they are today.
Based on their personalities, neither victim was the sort of person you'd expect to die in the way they did.
The night of the murder was Monday, May 19th, 1930. It was discovered on Tuesday, May 20th. And it got discovered because it was very uncommon for John to have his vehicle parked in front of the Golden Pheasant overnight. They would close. John would at times stay elsewhere. And John's vehicle had not moved over about a 24-hour period, maybe a little longer. One of the neighbors next door, and they would oftentimes go again to the Golden Pheasant to enjoy the chicken dinners or lunches that were served. The neighbor next door, the wife of this couple, was expressing concern that there had been no movement, and typically the Golden Pheasant was open on Mondays and it never opened. So he reluctantly went over. He kind of brushed it off. Everything is fine. And he went over there, found it locked, and kind of figured that, him and his girlfriend, Lucille, were just spending intimate time together, and he wasn't going to bother them. So that was on Monday night. Nothing was happening Monday, which was unusual. And he goes over there Monday night. He doesn't believe anything's amiss. The next day, Tuesday morning, May 20th, 1930, still no movement. And this neighbor is very concerned. This is unusual. So what she does, and I'm sure she would regret this later, is she sends her son over to the house because he is a lot more agile. And her son at the time, I believe, was about 5, 6 years old. And she asks her son to climb on the boxcar, which was next to the restaurant, right up against the restaurant, and look in a particular window. Well, and sure enough, he's able to do that. He looks in a window and he sees 2 bloodied and dead people on a bed inside this particular room. So that's how the murder gets discovered.
Local authorities were called to the scene.
And at the time, this jurisdiction would have been in Brown County, under the Brown County Sheriff's Department, because it wasn't City of Green Bay proper at this time in history. But the Sheriff's Department and the Police Department worked very well together. And the Sheriff's Department would ultimately get notified of the homicide and the death. They would be the initial responding officers, and then they would later notify the Green Bay Police Department and request our assistance, which is how we got involved in it.
A horror awaited these officers. And all these years later, Mike came face to face with that same horror in the form of the crime scene pictures.
We asked Mike to give us his insight on the details he's noticed about the crime scene.
I would say the evidence is that they were asleep at the time. John kind of lies in the same sleeping state. If anything, he likely gets hit in the head first. His hands maybe would have gone up to protect his head. That'd just be a natural response. But he remains in a very prone position, lifeless, where you will see it's just the opposite with Lucille. Lucille is in a very contorted position. What most likely happened is John was killed first and Lucille was killed second. And during the murder of John, Lucille most likely woke up. We make that conclusion based upon the defense wounds that exist on her forearms and her hands. So I'm sure she tried to do everything she could to fight off the attack. If John was struck first with the blunt force trauma on the head, he probably suffered a concussion absolutely immediately and would not have been able to defend himself much. Once John was obviously dead, which I don't think unfortunately took long, the suspect, and I'll say he, generally it probably was a male, turned his violence towards Lucille. I think the weapon had the ability to inflict both blunt force trauma and a slicing or cutting type of trauma as well, which is evidenced by the crime scene photos. It was probably some sort of blunt forced object, either a hatchet with a sharp blade on one side and kind of a blunted end on the back. Some surmise that it could have been a sickle, but I don't think a sickle was used because of the blunt force trauma to John's face. I mean, his face was, for lack of any better term, was bashed in. I mean, his eye sockets were crushed. The crime scene photo is chilling, and it is definitely a crime where a lot of emotion and a lot of passion existed. The violence that was exhibited upon both John and Lucille is absolutely horrendous.
As Mike examined the photos, he also saw something quite literally blood-curdling.
What is very eerie about the main crime scene photograph is that you can see there's blood splatter all over the wall, except in one section. And that is where you can nearly see the outline of a human being standing. It's creepy. So you see like blood all over, blood spatter, but you see this section, like this kind of oval-shaped section, which is completely clean, which was probably caused by the person who was standing there inflicting this horrendous violence. It's actually creepy to look at.
So how had the killer gotten into the Golden Pheasant to surprise John and Lucille in bed? And what was the motive for this awful killing?
So the other aspects of the scene that were worth noting is they did find an unlocked basement door, and they believe if access was gained, that's probably how it was gained, because there was no other evidence of any forced entry based upon the very minimal records that are available.
A local ring of slot machine thieves quickly attracted suspicion.
One of the slot machines was broken into. Now, I don't know how much they would get in a slot machine theft or burglary at the time, but there was also a cash drawer that was readily available, and that was never touched. So, I mean, we either presume that it wasn't touched because they didn't see it, or were they trying to stage something? And I doubt it was the latter. I just don't believe they saw it. They saw the slot machine as a place to get some money from, and maybe just didn't look.
But Mike has a hard time with the slot machine theory.
But I also don't think, based upon my many years of experience, education, and training, that this was a burglary gone wrong. I've investigated and responded to hundreds of burglaries, if not 1,000. And thankfully, most burglars are property crime criminals. They're trying to get in, trying to get out, and they don't want to, encounter anybody, at the time, because it's, well, there's risk there. If you break into a house and someone else is there, you might, get hurt. So I initially did not think, based upon the obvious emotion involved in the case, that it was just this random slot machine burglary that occurred, and then the suspect goes into the room and then just says, well, I'm going to kill them too. It was a very, very violent death and violent death scene.
From what Mike could find, the ring was never captured. But then again, they also didn't resort to violence in any other case.
Another suspect also arose early on in the investigation, Lucille's ex-husband. As you can imagine, investigators began to look into Frank Kupsik.
The first person that became the obvious suspect was the ex-husband, right? It was Frank. But Frank had an alibi. By all accounts, Frank was in Milwaukee at the time. He drove up to Green Bay a few days after the homicide itself to quote unquote clear his name. He was actually held in jail for a couple of days. They ultimately cleared him as a suspect.
But other names in the case have remained agonizingly elusive.
Our research brought us to some relatives that were still alive at the time, and one relative was a nephew. They did surmise that there was a suspect, and we don't know his name till this day, who was in the bar, who was hitting on Lucille that night. Lucille rebuffed his advances, citing that she's already in a relationship. The guy was intoxicated. Although he was not known, he was known to a friend of John's, because when they took this guy home, because they wanted him out of the bar because he was drunk, he was said to have kicked out the windows in the vehicle that was taking him home. And John kind of blew it off, like John oftentimes did. He wasn't a guy to deal with conflict. So that individual was considered a suspect at the time, but within the records, and I'll tell you more about the records in a bit, is that the name of that individual doesn't exist within the record.
So decades and decades later, with most witnesses and original detectives long dead, how does an investigator like Mike go about trying to solve a crime like this?
So you might be wondering, how the heck do we investigate this? So much like you had shared with me, you spend your time, looking at old newspapers or whatnot, which is how you locate these things. Well, back in 2004, when I began this research, I became a microfilm expert. I spent hours in front of microfilm, going through newspaper article after newspaper article after newspaper article. And then with my law enforcement experience, I'm good at finding people. I discovered that there was a coroner's inquest that was done on this case. Now I'm not sure how familiar you are with those processes, but the reason why a coroner's inquest is oftentimes held is that they believe that there are people who have information that will help them solve the case. So what a coroner's inquest does is you are essentially subpoenaed to it. Let's say you're asked to appear. You are sworn in, but it's not in a courtroom setting. You don't have the pressure of a trial. So in other words, we're going to interview as many people under oath as we can to get information that will help us solve this particular case.
But unfortunately, the ravages of time had another roadblock to throw at Mike.
Sadly, I think some of you familiar with historical true crime have already guessed where Mike's going with this coroner's report business.
When I heard about a coroner's inquest, I'm like, this is beautiful. This is going to be a treasure trove of information. Well, back in the 1950s, the Green Bay Police Department moved from the original City Hall location on North Jefferson Street to a supermarket, a vacant supermarket, where we became a temporary police department for 2 years while the new police department was being built. Some administrator, some chief, I don't know who made the decision to destroy all the records. So the records are gone. And even the coroner's inquest records are gone.
As a history nerd and someone who cares about true crime and cold cases, I couldn't help but interject here.
You just wish you could go back in time and just be like, don't throw these out.
I couldn't believe it, trust me.
But Mike wasn't about to give up.
So then what became our main source of history, stories, evidence, in addition to the newspaper, were the relatives that we were able to find. We did take some poetic license with the stories in order to create a narrative that people would be very interested in reading. but the story is based upon the facts that we know at the time that were available to us. The newspaper articles primarily, and then the narrative accounts that we were able to collect.
Still, it's hard for a law enforcement official in the 21st century to look back and see what was done in the 1930s, even by well-meaning and competent for their era investigators. Things like forensics are just so different now.
So as you know, in crime scenes today, when law enforcement responds to crime scenes, we do a much better job today of locking down the scene, making sure it's not contaminated. Well, back then, it was just the opposite. By the time law enforcement got there, you had, I don't know how many people, 10, 15, 20, 30, who were inside the roadhouse. Not only were they inside it, I guess some of them thought this is probably the end of the roadhouse. Some of them were taking souvenirs off the walls and taking them with them. Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Apparently, the Golden Pheasant's customer base became especially upset over one particular dish.
Many people were upset that it was closed because you couldn't get the chicken there anymore. I mean, for goodness sakes, 2 people died, but people seemed upset about the chicken.
To this day, it's not clear what forensics were found at the scene.
We had a detective at the time who was known statewide to be a fingerprint expert. He was very well known, very well trained. And fingerprints are very good evidence, but what's fascinating about fingerprints today is that fingerprinting evidence from 1930 until 2021 has not changed much. The only thing that has changed is the manner in which fingerprints are collected. We have more technologies to collect prints, to make prints appear, to examine, but the manner in which fingerprints are analyzed today outside of using computers hasn't changed. It's very, very simple. So they did call him to the scene, but there is no record of whether or not any useful fingerprints were found.
The Golden Pheasant case is especially frustrating, given that it would probably get solved almost immediately if it happened today, barring an incident to compromise the crime scene.
Had this crime occurred today, there was so much DNA evidence available at that scene that I'm confident you would identify a DNA strand that is either in a database, such as the CODIS database, either as a known or an unknown sample. And I am confident there was a blood trail that led away from the scene. How far did it go? I have no idea. But there was blood, and plenty of it, that was left at the scene and that was taken away from the scene.
From what Mike can tell, no strong leads came up after the crime. That being said, there were a few red herrings.
The murder weapon was never located. They did locate a hatchet of sorts buried in the backyard sometime later, but it wasn't believed to be the murder weapon itself. They did get early reports of a man who appeared to be intoxicated stumbling down the road away from the scene, but the police eventually concluded he was just a known vagrant to police and that he didn't have anything to do with the scene itself.
Oh, and in case you were wondering, Mike was not able to find any other cases like this one in the area, ones that featured a murdered couple bludgeoned to death in bed. There was a jailhouse confession, though.
So what happened in September 30th of that year, 1930, there was a jailhouse confession that was made related to this particular case. Now, we all know how jailhouse confessions are, right? We have to take them with a grain of salt. There's always a motive that somebody might make something up just to get time off their sentence or whatever it might be. And the confession occurred in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, which is approximately 60 minutes south of Green Bay. And a guy named Thomas Donnelly was in jail at the time. And another prisoner would later report that he confessed to the Golden Pheasant murder. Well, initially, and it would not be handled this way today, is they being the correctional officers, jail staff, pull Donnelly out of his cell and they interview him. and they try to get useful information regarding the golden pheasant. Donnelly gets all frustrated about it. He's pissed off that his cellmates would, rat on him like this. But as they press him, he denies it, he denies it, he denies it. The Sheboygan Sheriff's Department gets a hold of the Green Bay Police Department, and we send a detective to the Sheboygan County Jail to interview him further, hoping that a detective with some additional skill might be able to get him to confess. Well, sadly, he denies it. He denies it, maintains his denial, and they are never able to connect any evidence to Donnelly to the Golden Pheasant murders. So at the time they release him, and we never know what happens from then on.
So the double homicide went cold. There were no answers in store for the victims' loved ones, their customers, or the traumatized community. The Golden Pheasant remained closed forever. Nobody knew why this awful thing happened.
Well, it was obviously, shocking not only to the loved ones, but to the community as well. It made, headlines for a very long time. Besides the great loss of John and Lucille, a daughter, a 5-year-old daughter at the time, Betty Jane, ended up growing up without a mom and spent the rest of her life being raised by her grandparents, primarily in Sturgeon Bay. And they ultimately were seeking answers. And by the time, we got our hands on it, you're talking kind of another generation removed. So we had to, maybe we were maybe talking to, a nephew, and maybe the uncle would have had more information, and which may have been the brother of John. So we're talking 2 generations removed. But it rocked the community. It shocked Green Bay and the surrounding county. And like many crimes back then, when something so violent like that happened, the community would then lock their doors, which is foreign to me. I think you should lock your doors anyways. But it became definitely the headline of the day until the next major crime occurred, and it ended up closing the business. I don't think it ever reopened, and it was something that did live on within the town of Preble at the time, until it became the city of Green Bay, and it was ultimately torn down. The intersection today is University Avenue and Dan's. And even when the seance took place at the location, it has since changed again. So it went from the Golden Pheasant to Lee's Cantonese restaurant to now a strip mall is what it is today.
Yep, you heard that right. There was a seance in this case, and it was about as silly as you can possibly imagine.
So they did a seance, and what they did is the individual who did the seance, the psychic that did the seance, after the Golden Pheasant seance, he has never done a seance like this again. He was so freaked out by it. And what they did is he did what, and I don't know much about their techniques or their approaches, but they did what was called an automatic writing exercise. And I believe the theory is we're going to connect with the spirit here. The spirit's going to speak to me, and I'm going to write down just automatically what the spirit says. So they start communicating with what they believe are the spirits of either Lucille or John. And what they discover at the time is they believe the spirits tell them that the murder weapon that was used is a corn sickle, that the individual that committed the murder had a dark beard and a prominent nose, but as of 1990, the killer died between 1940 and 1942 in a car crash in Chicago. During the seance, some very unusual tapping occurred, completely unexpected, that nobody had ever heard before. And the psychic would later say that he was so emotionally impacted by it and the connection that occurred that he will only now do seances for entertainment.
So what's the status of this case now in 2021?
Because the coroner's inquest records are gone, we don't have access to the information that they were considering at the time. So we don't have a sound suspect in this particular case.
But Mike believes he has a sense of the broad motivation behind the crime.
We have motive. We think the motive was a crime of passion. I go back to my original conclusion. It was clearly a crime of passion. and of great emotion. But, was it a jilted lover? Was it, somebody who was intoxicated and rebuffed and then came back later that night in some sort of fit of jealousy? Was it an interrupted burglary? If it was, it'd be unusual. It'd be unusual for burglars to suddenly become murderers. So it is definitely, we call it a cold case for a reason, because it's still a cold case today. In speaking with the surviving relatives at the time were unable to provide us with any enemies that John had. That would explain it. I don't think it was connected to any sort of prohibition type activities, any sort of gambling or gambling debts, or anything related to prostitution. There's nothing in the record that says John was necessarily a keeper of prostitution or running prostitutes. Did they go there to carry out their business? Yeah, they did. But there was nothing in the record to indicate that he was the one who was making the arrangements, if you will. So we don't have a solid theory as far as a suspect is concerned. I pride myself in being able to discover it, but like you said, I want to strangle the person that that decided we don't need these records. Let's just throw them away. It's definitely a mystery. But what we do have is insightful, but it's not enough for us to identify a suspect, unfortunately.
Please, if you happen to know anything about the Golden Pheasant case, contact Mike Knetzger at the Green Bay Police Department. His email is mikenetzger@greenbaywi.gov. That's MikeKnetzger@greenbaywi.gov.
Thanks very much to Mike for his time and insight on this case. Don't forget, you can find his book on Amazon. But again, just note that a new edition with an extra cold case will also be coming out soon.
We also want to extend our thanks to the Green Bay Police Department for connecting us with Mike. It's always really nice to encounter a modern-day institution that is so serious about understanding and preserving its own history.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on The Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter @MurderSheet, and on Facebook @MSheetPodcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to The Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.